Hey guys, and welcome to another very exciting visual effects tutorial. Today I will show you how to create a grand cinematic sunrise over planet Earth in outer space. But without the Pac-Man. This is part 2 of my 5-part tutorial series on how to create a cool camera zoom effect all the way from outer space down to the Earth, into the city and into a building. In the last part, in part 1, we used Cinema 4D to set up a 3D scene of the sun rising over planet Earth, and we then rendered out quite a number of different layers. Today we will take all of those layers and composite them together into an epic sunrise scene using Adobe After Effects. I highly recommend that you watch part 1 of this tutorial series first, but if you haven't yet, or maybe you just don't want to, I am going to put all of the footage that you need to follow along with this tutorial down in the description of this video. This is going to be an upper intermediate tutorial, and I will assume that you are very comfortable using Adobe After Effects. If this is still your first or second date with After Effects, I recommend checking out some of my beginner tutorials first. But to not drag this out any longer, let's jump right into the tutorial. Here we are in Adobe After Effects. Let's start out by importing all of the layers that we've rendered out using Cinema 4D. Navigate to where you've got the footage stored, and one thing I like to do when working with such a huge amount of different images, I like to filter them down so I only see the first image of every single sequence. Select the first image of any sequence, make sure you're marking this as a PNG sequence, and then hit Import. Now repeat this process to import all of the other sequences into our project. Before we get started, let's clean this up a little bit so it's a little bit easier to work with all of the different layers. First, I'm going to give all of these layers the proper name: city lights, clouds, illumination, object buffer Earth, object buffer Sun, and sunrise over Earth. Then right-click on the first image sequence and go to Interpret Footage, Main. Change the frame rate over to 24 frames per second. This is important because this is the frame rate that we used when we exported this image sequence from Cinema 4D. Another thing I generally also like to do with any footage that I've rendered out of a 3D program is to go over into the Color Management tab and enable the Preserve RGB option. And again, repeat this process for every single image sequence. Lastly, I'm going to import one more image that I got off the internet. This is an image taken by NASA of our Milky Way using the Spitzer telescope. We are going to use this as the background for our sunrise scene. As always, a link to this image will be in the description of the video. Again, just to keep things neat, let's rename this image to Milky Way. Now let's get started and create a new composition. I'm going to call this one Sunrise over Earth. I'm going to leave the width and height at 1920 by 1080, and I'm going to change the frame rate to 24 frames per second. Finally, I'm going to set the duration of my composition to 15 seconds, which is just a little bit longer than the layers we rendered out from Cinema 4D, and hit OK. First off, let's create the background for our scene. Drag the Milky Way image down into your composition. Let's zoom out a little bit and scale this down because this is a rather large image. While this is a really amazing photo of our Milky Way, it is a little bit too bright and a little bit too busy to really work as a background. So let's change the colors a little bit. First off, apply a tint effect to the layer. We don't want the Milky Way to go all black and white, so let's change the map white to color to a fairly desaturated blue. Also, personally, I like to retain a little bit of the original color of the image in my scene, so let's reduce the amount to tint to maybe around 80%. Next, apply a brightness and contrast effect to the Milky Way layer, and let's bring down the brightness by quite a lot to darken out the image, maybe to around -130. I'm also going to jack up the contrast just so that the image doesn't look quite as flat and there's a little bit more variance. This looks pretty good. Now the next thing I want to do is I actually want to add some twinkling stars in the distance just to bring a little bit of life to this background image. For this, I'm going to duplicate the Milky Way layer and rename the new layer to Stars. For this layer, I want to extract just the bright pieces, just the stars out of the layer, so I can overlay them and animate them a little bit to flicker and bring a little bit of life to the scene. In order to do that, let's first remove the brightness and contrast effect from the stars layer, so it's nice and bright again. And now let's extract just the bright pieces of the layer. In order to do that, you're going to use, yes, exactly, you're going to use the extract effect. So apply the extract effect to the stars layer. The extract effect allows you to specify a certain range of luminance or chrominance to extract out of the current layer. To really be able to see this effect though, let's quickly disable the visibility on the Milky Way layer. If we now bring up the lower end of this luminance selector, you'll notice that all of the dark pieces of the image start being cut out. All we're left with are the really bright parts of the image, which is mainly just the stars. If you toggle the transparency grid, you can see that most of the layer has actually become transparent. The only thing that's left, the pieces that we've extracted from this layer, is just the bright parts of the image, mainly just the stars. If you now re-enable the Milky Way image and toggle the stars layer on and off, you can really see the bright spots that are being added by the stars layer. Yes, there's a pretty bright blotch right in the center of the screen because of the brightness of the galaxy of the original image, but this is not going to be much of an issue because the planet Earth will basically be covering most of the center of the scene anyways. To add just a little bit more intensity to the stars, let's apply a glow effect to the layer. I'm going to bring down the glow threshold just by a little bit, and feel free to tweak the radius just to give the stars just a little bit more of a shine. While I think this background scene actually looks pretty cool, I do want to add a little bit of twinkle to the stars just to add a little bit more life into the scene. For that, let's create a new solid. I will call mine Stars Matte, make sure it's 1920 by 1080 to fit our comp size, and then hit OK. Next, add a turbulent noise effect to the Stars Matte layer and then add an expression to the evolution property. In the expression editor, simply type time star 100. This will animate our noise over time so we get a little bit of a shifting pattern. Finally, set the track matte option on the stars layer to Luma Matte. If you now scrub through your composition, you will notice the stars layer fade in and out a little bit more organically, making the whole scene seem to twinkle a little bit. This is a fairly subtle effect, but it just adds a little bit more life into our scene. Now that we're done with the background, select all layers and pre-compose them. I'm going to call this composition Milky Way Comp. Now that we're finally done with that, let's finally get to adding the sunrise. Go back to your project window and let's drag the sunrise over Earth image sequence into our composition. Well, here's our sunrise beauty pass, but because it's not transparent, obviously the background has vanished. However, we do have two object buffers, one for the Earth and one for the Sun, that we can apply to this layer to cut the Earth and the Sun really cleanly out from this image. For that, drag the object buffer for the Earth just above the sunrise layer. Then drag the object buffer for the Sun on top of that. Select both the object buffer for the Sun and the object buffer for the Earth and pre-compose those two layers. I will call this composition Sunrise Matte Comp. Hit OK. Let's jump into this composition and let's change the blend mode of the top layer, which in this case is the Sun, to Add. Bam! What we have now is a track matte that contains both the Sun and the Earth. Let's go back to our parent composition and on the Sunrise over Earth layer, which should sit just below the Sunrise Matte Comp we just created, change the track matte option to Luma Matte. And voila! We now have the Sunrise Beauty Pass composited on top of the Milky Way background. Next, let's add the Clouds layer on top of the Earth. Simply drag the Clouds image sequence to the top of your composition. Again, this image sequence does not have an alpha channel and therefore is fully opaque, but is pretty easy to composite. All I'm going to do is change the blend mode of the Clouds layer over to Screen. Bam! Here's our Clouds layer nicely composited on top of the Earth. Next, let's add the city lights into the scene. Select the city lights image sequence from your project window and drag it into your composition just below the Clouds layer. Same as with the Clouds layer, this image sequence does not actually have an alpha channel. Again, let's simply change the blend mode, and in this case I'm not going to use Screen because I want a little bit more intensity for the city lights. I'm going to change the blend mode to Add. And there they are, nice little city lights composited into our scene. If we go to the end of the sequence, you can really see how nicely the city lights stand out on planet Earth. I am going to intensify them a little bit, and I'm also going to tint them a little bit more yellow. One plugin that I've actually been using a lot and I really enjoy it, also because it's free, is the CC Color Vibrance effect from Video Copilot. You can download this plugin for free from the Video Copilot website, and again, there will be a link to this plugin down in the description of the video. Apply the Color Vibrance effect to the city lights layer and go over into the effect settings and change the color to a fairly desaturated yellow. This will tint our city lights nice and yellow and it'll preserve the luminance and make them stand out even better. Finally, let's also apply a glow effect to the city lights layer. I'm just going to lower the glow threshold a little bit and maybe jack up the glow intensity to make the city lights stand out even better. Yep, this I like. I think this actually looks really cool. Let's rewind our composition and play this back. Cool, that looks really good. There's only two things I want to tweak. First off, I think the city lights are just a little bit too yellow, so I am going to lower the vibrance option in the color vibrance effect. I'm also going to reduce the glow intensity a little bit again, maybe to 1.2. I think I was going a little bit overboard there. Now, the next thing you will notice is that the city lights are still visible even in the areas where the sun has actually risen. Well, technically when the sun rises, people usually switch off their lights, so the lights in the bright part of the Earth should probably not be visible. Fortunately, we rendered out an illumination path that we can use really easily as a track matte to hide all the lights in the bright areas on planet Earth. Go back to your project window and drag the illumination path on top of your city lights layer. Let's quickly disable the clouds layer so you can more easily see what the illumination path actually looks like. Looks pretty good as a track matte, but because I do want the edge of where the city lights are visible and invisible to be a little bit stronger, let's increase the contrast of this layer. Add a brightness and contrast effect to the layer, and let's jack up the brightness all the way to 150 and reduce the contrast all the way to -100. Next, let's actually rename this layer to City Lights Matte, and then on the City Lights layer, change the track matte option to Luma Inverted. This will now suppress the city lights in the areas on planet Earth where the sun has already risen. Cool, you can really see how all the lights are being turned off as the sun rises. Next, looking at this, planet Earth seems rather naked. Planet Earth is usually surrounded by atmosphere, which, in images from outer space, appears blue. In order to add an atmospheric layer around planet Earth, go back into your project window, select the object buffer for the Earth, and then drag it into your composition just below the sunrise over Earth image, just above the Milky Way. Rename this layer to Atmosphere and then apply a fast blur effect to it. As you jack up the blurriness, you will immediately see the atmosphere of planet Earth appear, and you can kind of get a feeling for how this effect is going to look. Let's reduce the blurriness to maybe around 80. Obviously, the atmosphere around planet Earth should be blue, so let's apply a color vibrance effect to the layer. Change the color to a healthy blue to add a really nice layer of atmosphere around planet Earth. Next, change the blend mode of the atmosphere layer to add, and because the atmosphere is way too strong in the scene, let's reduce the opacity to maybe around 30 to 40%. Cool, it's starting to come together pretty nicely. In order to give the scene a little bit more impact, let's add a glow to the sun as well as to the rim around the Earth where the sun is rising. Go back into the project window and drag another copy of the Sunrise over Earth beauty path into your composition and place it at the very top. Rename this layer to Sun and then drag an object buffer for the sun right on top of it. Change the track matte option on the sun layer to Luma Matte. Then select both the sun layer and the object buffer of the sun directly above it and pre-compose them. I'm going to call this new composition Sun Comp. Hit OK, and let's apply a glow effect to the Sun Comp layer. Let's bring down the glow threshold, increase the radius and jack up the intensity, and if you find that the glow effect is rather weak for what you're expecting, it usually is because your project is running in 8 bits per channel. Change the project over to use 32 bits per channel by alt-clicking onto this little text and bam, there it is. The glow for the sun, obviously it's way too strong, so let's go back over into the glow effect and let's reduce the intensity back down to maybe 1, maybe even a little bit less, and let's jack up the glow radius just by a little bit. Cool, so that now added a really nice glow just on top of the sun. Next, let's add a really nice glow on the edge of the Earth just where the sun is rising. We're going to use exactly the same technique, so go over into your project window and drag yet another copy of the Sunrise over Earth layer into your composition and place it at the very top. Change the name of this layer to Earth Rim and then back in your project window, pick the illumination path and drag it on top of the Earth Rim layer. Again, to make this effect a little bit more dramatic and make sure that we're not including any of the rest of the Earth because we really just want the glow along the edge, let's apply a curves effect to the illumination layer. Let's suppress the dark parts of this illumination layer so we're just left with the bright edge of the Earth. Finally, change the track matte option for the Earth Rim layer over to Luma Matte. As before, select the Earth Rim layer and the illumination layer just above it and pre-compose them. This one I'm going to call Earth Rim Comp and then hit OK. Again, apply a glow effect to the Earth Rim layer and let's reduce the threshold and jack up the radius a little bit, maybe the intensity a little bit as well, to add a really nice glow along the edge of planet Earth. Let's rewind this composition and play it back. It is looking pretty sweet, but it will probably look even more impressive if you re-enable the clouds layer as well. Yep, there you go. Looks a lot more complete that way. Finally, and this is optional, let's add an optical flare effect to intensify the moment when the sun is coming over the edge of the Earth. For this, we are going to use the Optical Flares plugin by Video Copilot. Personally, I'm a big fan of the plugin and it's great value and highly recommended. If you don't have the plugin, there are a few other ways to do this, or if you don't really need it, you can probably leave this effect out. Let's create a new solid and let's call this one Optical Flares. Make sure it sits at the very top of our composition. And let's apply the Optical Flares effect from Video Copilot to this layer. Let's change the blend mode of the layer to add, and let's position the optical flare right on top of the sun. Let's also move the center position over a little bit to the right so the rays are radiating off towards the right side of the scene. Let's bring up the options and let's just pick a preset that we like. I don't really want to customize too much. Maybe we'll look under natural flares, and yeah, this one is good. I like this one. Let's go with rim light. Let's bring in the center position a little bit again so we can see these really cool edge elements of the flare. Next, let's reduce the scale of the optical flares effect because this is way too bright, maybe to around 50% or so. Yep, this looks a little bit better. We just want a little bit of that flare effect in the scene. And then we need to animate the flare so it appears just as the sun rises, and just here when we're starting to zoom in on the Earth and the Earth starts obscuring the sun again, we want the flare to vanish. Go to the time in your composition where the sun starts to rise, yeah, just about here, and then disable the optical flares effect for now. Okay, we have to go back just a little bit further. I can still see the edge of the sun poking out. Let's zoom in a little bit and make sure the optical flare is positioned exactly at the location where the sun will appear over the edge of the Earth. Let's re-enable the optical flares, then add a keyframe to the scale and bring the scale down to 0. Move forward a few frames, make sure the optical flares are still properly positioned on top of the sun, and let's increase the scale. Again, don't go overboard, maybe to around 30. Let's zoom out a little bit. Yep, I think that'll probably do. And so now what will happen is as the sun rises, the optical flare will appear. Cool, that looks pretty good. The flare comes in a little bit stiff, so let's open up the keyframes and let's change the keyframes over to Bezier so it kind of eases in and eases out of the animation a little bit. Finally, we need to animate the flare effect to vanish again once we start zooming in on the scene and the sun gets blocked by the Earth. So just about here, just when we're starting to zoom in on the scene, we need to set another keyframe for the scale, then move forward a little bit, and just about here, I reckon the flare would probably have vanished by then. So let's change the scale back down to 0. Let's play this piece back. Cool, looks pretty good to me. The last thing to do is go back to the beginning of our composition and play back our complete sunrise over planet Earth in outer space effect. And that's all there is to part 2. In the next part, in part 3, I will show you how to create the scene of the camera diving into a layer of clouds, revealing a city night scene below, then diving off into another layer of clouds down towards the city. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. As always, if you have any comments, questions or suggestions, just leave them down in the section below. If you want to see more cool visual effects and filmmaking tutorials, make sure you subscribe to my channel. And I'd also greatly appreciate it if you could give this video a thumbs up, favorite it and share it with the world. If you want to get in contact or simply stay up to date with what's going on, you can also find and follow me on Facebook, Twitter or on Google+. Until next time, I will see you later. Waka, waka.